February 1945, northern Germany. The wind screamed across the frozen wasteland like a hurt animal. Sergeant James McKnight pulled his coat tighter as ice crystals stung his face. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. The thermometer clipped to his pack read 5 degrees Celsius. That was cold enough to kill a man in a few hours, cold enough to freeze skin solid in minutes. McKnight and his four-man Canadian reconnaissance crew had been stuck in this same position for 36 hours. Their orders were simple. Watch the road. Report enemy movement. Don't get involved with civilians. The war was almost over. Everyone knew it. The German forces were falling back, retreating deeper into their own land. But that didn't make the cold any easier to bear. It didn't make the waiting any less terrible. Then McKnight heard it, a sound that did not belong in this frozen hell. At first, he thought the wind was playing tricks on him, but there it was again, crying, faint and far away, but definitely crying. The kind of sound that grabbed your heart and squeezed it. "You hear that?" McKnight asked his corporal, a tough kid from Toronto named Davies. Davies tilted his head, listening. "Hear what? Just when, Sarge?" But McKnight heard it clearly now. Children, multiple voices, weak and desperate, coming from somewhere to the east, maybe 200 yards away, in the direction of a bombed-out town they had passed the day before. Nothing but rubble and broken walls. No one should be alive there. This was exactly the kind of situation their commanders had warned them about. The roads were full of German refugees, thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. Old people, women, children, all running from the advancing Soviet forces in the east, running toward the British and Canadian lines in the west, because at least the Western allies would not shoot them on sight. The German military could not protect them anymore. The evacuation plans had collapsed. People were dying in ditches, freezing in abandoned buildings, starving in the snow. And the Canadian Army's position was clear. This is not our problem. We are soldiers, not babysitters. We have a mission. Stick to the mission. McKnight was 28 years old. Before the war, he had spent his whole life on a farm in Manitoba. He knew cold. He knew what it did to living things. He had found frozen cattle in the fields after bad storms. He knew exactly what those children were going through right now, wherever they were. "I'm going to check it out," McKnight said. Davies looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Sarge, we can't leave our position. Orders are orders. We're supposed to—" "I know what the orders are," McKnight interrupted. "But I also know what I'm hearing. Those are kids, Davies, little kids." The other 3 men in the crew had gathered around now. Wilson, the radio operator, Patterson, barely 19 years old, and Kowalski, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since they'd crossed into Germany. They all looked at McKnight with the same expression. Part of them wanted to help. Part of them knew better. "What if it's a trap?" Wilson asked quietly. "Germans could be using kids as bait. Wouldn't be the first time." McKnight had thought of that. The Germans were desperate now. Some units were fighting like cornered animals. But this didn't feel like a trap. Traps didn't cry like that. Traps didn't sound so weak, so hopeless. "Then we'll find out together," McKnight said. "But I'm going. Anyone who wants to stay here, stay here. No judgment." Nobody stayed. That was the thing about soldiers. They complained about everything, questioned every order. But when it came down to it, they stuck together. If their sergeant was walking into potential danger, they were walking with him. The crying grew louder as they moved through the snow. McKnight could make out individual voices now, young voices. Some crying, some calling out in German, words he couldn't understand, but the meaning was crystal clear. "Help us. Please help us." The bombed-out schoolhouse appeared through the snow like a broken tooth, 3 walls still standing. The roof collapsed on one side. The windows were all blown out. The front door hung at a crazy angle. McKnight had walked past this building yesterday and assumed it was completely dead. Just another corpse of a building in a country full of them. The crying was coming from inside, from below. A basement, maybe. McKnight pushed through the broken doorway. The inside of the building was somehow even colder than outside. No wind, but no warmth either. Just dead, frozen air. He found the basement stairs. Half of them had collapsed, but enough remained to climb down. What he found in that basement would stay with him for the rest of his life. 18 children huddled together in the corner like a pile of puppies trying to stay warm. The oldest looked maybe 12. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Their lips were blue. Their skin was gray. Some of them weren't even crying anymore, just staring with empty eyes that had given up hope. They had been down here for at least 36 hours, shivering and starving. McKnight figured. Maybe longer. No heat, no food, no water except for snow. They had tried to eat. Two of the older children had wrapped the younger ones in their own coats and were holding them close, trying to share body heat, trying to keep them alive. When the children saw the Canadian soldiers, several of them screamed. These were enemy soldiers, soldiers who had bombed their cities and killed their fathers. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the smallest child, a little girl with blonde hair, started crying again. Not the hopeless crying from before, something different. The crying of a child who sees adults and thinks maybe, just maybe, someone will help. McKnight made a decision in that frozen basement that would change everything. He didn't think about military protocol. He didn't think about orders or regulations or what his commanders would say. He thought about his kid sister back home in Manitoba. He thought about what his mother would want him to do. "We're taking them," he said quietly. "All of them." Davy stared at McKnight like he had just suggested they fly to the moon. "Sarge, our truck fits 8 people, maybe 10 if we're packed tight. There's 18 kids here, plus the 5 of us. That's 23 people total." McKnight was already moving, checking each child. The 2 in the corner weren't responding when he touched them. Their skin felt like ice. Hypothermia. Severe hypothermia. If they didn't get warm in the next hour, they'd be dead. "Then we make it fit," he said. "Start bringing them up carefully, like some of them can't walk." The crew moved fast. Kowalski, the strongest, carried 3 of the smallest children at once. Patterson took 2 older boys who could barely stand. Wilson helped a girl who looked about 10 but weighed almost nothing. Starvation on top of freezing. McKnight carried the 2 hypothermia cases himself, one under each arm, trying to be gentle. But knowing speed mattered more right now. Getting them to the truck was only the first problem. When McKnight opened the back, he did quick math in his head. The truck bed was exactly 6 feet wide and 8 feet long. 48 square feet to fit 23 human beings. It was impossible. But impossible didn't matter anymore. "Out with the equipment," McKnight ordered. "Everything except the radio, medical kit, and weapons. Everything else goes in the snow." They worked like machines. Spare ammunition boxes, tool kits, extra fuel cans, rations they had been saving. All of it went into the snow beside the road. When they were done, they had maybe doubled their space. Still not enough. "We'll sit on the benches," Wilson said, pointing to the metal benches that ran along both sides of the truck bed. "Put the kids on the floor between us. Pack them tight." It was the only way. They started loading children. The smallest ones went in first, right near the ground where the engine heat would reach them. The older children filled in around them. McKnight made sure the 2 hypothermia cases were positioned directly against the metal wall that separated the truck bed from the engine. That wall would be warm. Not warm enough, but better than nothing. The children were too scared and cold to resist. Most of them didn't even seem to understand what was happening. A few of the older ones tried to say something in German. "Thank you, maybe. Or please don't hurt us." McKnight couldn't tell. He just kept moving, kept organizing, kept trying to fit impossible pieces into an impossible puzzle. When all 18 children were loaded, the crew climbed in. They sat on the benches with children pressed against their legs, wedged between their boots. Kowalski had a small boy sitting on his lap. Davies had 2 girls leaning against his sides. There was no room to move, barely room to breathe, but everyone was in. McKnight grabbed the radio handset before they started driving. He had to report this, had to tell someone what they were doing. The radio crackled and hissed. Then a voice came through. "Command Post, Lieutenant Davidson. Recon 4. This is base. Report." McKnight chose his words carefully. "Base. We've encountered 18 German civilians, children, critical condition, severe hypothermia. We're transporting them to the nearest Allied medical station." Silence long enough that McKnight thought the radio had died. Then Davidson's voice came back, sharp and cold. Recon 4 negative. You are not authorized to transport civilians. Contact German authorities in the nearest town. And there are no German authorities, McKnight interrupted. Sir, these children will be dead in 2 hours if we don't move them now. Two of them might already be past saving. Another pause. McKnight could picture Davidson at the command post, probably with a dozen officers standing around him, all of them thinking about regulations and proper procedure and what headquarters would say, all of them knowing that saving children wasn't part of the mission. Recon 4, you are ordered to maintain your observation position. You cannot abandon your post for Sir. McKnight's voice was steady but firm. I'm not abandoning anything. I'm requesting permission to complete a humanitarian evacuation. If you deny that permission, I'm doing it anyway and accepting whatever consequences come after. The radio went silent again. McKnight waited. The children waited. His crew waited. Everyone barely breathing in the freezing truck. When Davison came back on, his voice had changed, softer, more human. The nearest medical station is 42 kilometers west. Route is through potentially hostile territory. You'll be passing through 3 towns we haven't fully cleared yet. If you get into trouble, I can't send help. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Then get those kids to safety, Sergeant. I'll deal with headquarters. Davidson out. McKnight felt something release in his chest. They had permission. Sort of. Maybe enough to move. The drive was 4 hours of pure hell. The truck's heater was designed for the cab, not the open bed. McKnight had them rotate the children every 15 minutes. The ones who had been near the warm engine wall got moved to the outer edges. The ones from the edges got moved to the center. Keep the warmth moving, keep the blood flowing. They shared their water, one canteen between 23 people. Each child got 2 small sips, not enough to matter, but enough to wet their mouths, to remind their bodies that water existed. Patterson had chocolate in his pack. He broke it into tiny pieces, 1 piece per child. Some were too cold to chew. He let the chocolate melt in his palm and then let them lick it from his hand like puppies. McKnight kept checking the 2 hypothermia cases. The girl was responding a little. Her eyes would focus sometimes. She tried to curl up tighter when he touched her. That was good. That meant her body was still fighting. The boy worried him more. Too still, too quiet. McKnight pressed his own warm hands against the boy's chest every few minutes, trying to push heat into him through sheer willpower. They passed through the first town without incident. Abandoned, everyone gone. The second town had some German civilians on the streets, old men mostly. They stared at the truck full of children but didn't move. Didn't try to stop them or help, just stared. The third town was different. McKnight saw German soldiers, maybe a dozen of them, young kids mostly, probably 15 or 16 years old. The last scraps of Hitler's army. They had rifles. They looked confused, angry, and desperate. Exactly the combination that got people killed. Davies had his weapon ready. So did Wilson, but McKnight shook his head. Don't point at them. Don't even look aggressive. We're just passing through. The truck rolled slowly down the main street. The German soldiers watched. One of them, an officer maybe, stepped into the road, raised his hand. Stop. McKnight's heart hammered. If shooting started now in this packed truck, children would die. Lots of them. Then one of the older girls in the truck stood up, wobbling, weak, but standing. She called out in German. Fast words McKnight couldn't follow, but he heard one word repeated. Kinder, children. The German officer looked at the truck bed, really looked. Saw the pile of frozen children. Saw Canadian soldiers sitting among them. Not guarding them, but protecting them. His face changed. The anger drained away. He lowered his hand and stepped aside, waved them through. Nobody in the truck breathed until they were a mile past that town. The Allied medical station appeared through the snow like a miracle. 3 large tents with red crosses painted on white canvas. Trucks parked in neat rows, soldiers moving with purpose. McKnight had never been so happy to see anything in his entire life. When they pulled up to the main tent, doctors and nurses came running. They had been radioed ahead. They knew what was coming, but knowing and seeing were 2 different things. McKnight watched their faces change as they looked into the truck bed. 18 German children packed like sardines, blue lips, gray skin, eyes that had stopped hoping for anything. "Get them inside now," a doctor shouted. He was British, older, with gray hair and steady hands. The two hypothermia cases first. "Move, move, move." The medical staff worked like a well-oiled machine. They had heating blankets ready, warm, water bottles, hot soup that smelled like heaven. They took the children one by one, checking them quickly, sorting them by severity. The two hypothermia cases disappeared into the surgical tent immediately. The rest were wrapped in blankets and carried to heated recovery areas. McKnight stood in the snow and watched it all happen. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from something else. Relief maybe, or delayed fear. He had been holding himself together for 4 hours. And now that the children were safe, his body was remembering how to fall apart. A nurse approached him. "Young woman," Canadian accent. "Sergeant, we need information. Do you know their names, ages, medical history?" McKnight shook his head. "We found them in a basement. They don't speak English. We don't speak German. I don't know anything except they were freezing to death." She nodded and walked away. McKnight heard her organizing translators, getting German-speaking staff to talk with the older children, finding out who they were and where they had come from. The final count came 2 hours later. All 18 children alive. The girl with hypothermia was responding to treatment. Her core temperature had been 28 degrees Celsius when she arrived. Normal was 37. She had been 9 degrees away from death, but she was warming up. Her heart was beating stronger. The boy was in worse shape. Core temperature of 26 degrees. His heart had nearly stopped twice on the operating table. The doctors had worked on him for 90 minutes straight, warming him slowly, carefully, bringing him back from the edge 1 degree at a time. He had survived, they said, but he would lose parts of 3 fingers on his left hand and 2 toes on his right foot. Frostbite damage too severe to save. Small pieces of himself that the cold had claimed as payment for his life. 2 other children had frostbite as well. One girl lost the tip of her left pinky finger. One boy lost parts of 2 toes. 15 of the 18 children escaped with nothing worse than mild frostbite and malnutrition. In that frozen wasteland, in those conditions, that counted as a miracle. McKnight was writing his report when the military police arrived. 2 officers. Neither looked happy. "Sergeant James McKnight, that's me. You're to come with us. There's an inquiry. Questions about your conduct during the operation." McKnight had known this was coming. You didn't abandon your post, even for the best reasons, without consequences. He followed them to a different tent where 3 senior officers sat behind a folding table. A colonel, a major, and a captain. All of them looking at McKnight like he was a problem they needed to solve. The colonel spoke first. "Sergeant, you left your assigned observation post without authorization. You transported enemy civilians against direct orders. You put your crew at risk by driving through unsecured territory. Do you understand the severity of these violations?" "Yes, sir." "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" McKnight thought about it. He could explain about the crying he heard, about the children's faces, about how cold it was, and how little time they had. But none of that would matter to these men. They cared about rules and regulations and proper procedure. "No, sir," McKnight said quietly. "I did what I did. I'd do it again." The major leaned forward. "You do it again, even knowing you could face court-martial, even knowing you endangered your entire crew." "Sir, with respect, I didn't endanger my crew. They volunteered. Every single one of them could have stayed at the observation post. They chose to come. That's not how military discipline works, Sergeant. When you make a decision, your men follow. That's what they're trained to do. You abused that trust." The captain, who had been quiet until now, cleared his throat. "I have a question. When you found those children, what did you see specifically?" McKnight looked at him. Really looked. The captain was younger than the others, maybe 30. He had kind eyes. "I saw children, sir. Not German children, not enemy children. Just children. Cold and scared and dying. I saw my little sister back home. I saw every kid I ever knew. And I knew that if I left them there, I'd never forgive myself. Not in 1,000 years." The tent went quiet. McKnight could hear wind buffeting the canvas walls, could hear voices outside, soldiers talking, life continuing. The colonel shuffled papers. This inquiry will remain open while we determine appropriate action. You're confined to base until further notice. Dismissed. McKnight saluted and left. Outside, his crew was waiting. They had been questioned too, probably faced the same accusations and threats, but they were all smiling. Heard all the kids made it, Davies said, even the bad ones. They're going to try to find their families, Wilson added. They got translators talking to them. Some of them have relatives in other towns. Some of them don't know if their families are still alive. Patterson, the youngest, looked at McKnight with something like awe. You think they'll really court-martial us, Sarge? Maybe, probably not. They'd have to admit that saving children is against regulations. That's not a good look. What McKnight didn't know yet was how fast the story was spreading. One of the nurses had written to her family about it. One of the doctors had mentioned it in his official report. By the end of the week, journalists would hear about it. Canadian soldiers saving German children. Human kindness in the middle of war. It was exactly the kind of story people needed to hear in those dark days of 1945. But there were other stories too. Stories that didn't make the newspapers. In the same region during the same week, other Allied units had followed proper procedure. They had found German civilians in distress and contacted authorities, waited for proper channels, followed the rules, and while they waited, people died. The numbers were hard to count, but estimates put it around 200 civilians who froze to death that week, while soldiers followed orders and maintained their positions. McKnight learned about this later. It made him feel sick and angry and sad all at once. 200 people, maybe more, all dead because no one wanted to break the rules. Back in the medical tent, the 18 children were getting stronger. The older ones told their stories through translators. Their town had been evacuated 3 days earlier. Their parents had put them in the schoolhouse basement for shelter while they went to find food and transportation. Then the bombing started. Buildings collapsed. Roads became impassable. Their parents never came back. They had waited in that basement for 2 days, hoping someone would find them, hoping their mothers and fathers would return. The cold got worse. The crying got weaker. Then they heard boots on the stairs and saw foreign soldiers in strange uniforms. They thought they were going to die. Instead, they got blankets and chocolate and warm hands holding them close during a long truck ride to safety. One of the older girls, maybe 11 years old, said something to the translator. The translator smiled and turned to McKnight. She says she didn't know enemy soldiers could be kind. She thought kindness died when the war started. She says you taught her that maybe some good things still exist in the world. McKnight didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded and walked away before anyone could see the tears in his eyes. The military inquiry dragged on for 3 weeks. During that time, something unexpected happened. The story got out. A reporter for a Canadian newspaper heard about it from a medic who had been at the station. He wrote an article. Then another newspaper picked it up, then another. Within a month, people across Canada and Britain knew about the sergeant who had saved 18 German children. The military brass found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't publicly punish soldiers for saving children. The headlines would be devastating. But they also couldn't ignore that McKnight had abandoned his post and disobeyed direct orders. So they did what bureaucracies always do when faced with impossible choices. They did nothing. The inquiry quietly closed with no formal charges, no punishment, but also no commendation, no recognition. McKnight and his crew went back to regular duty like nothing had happened. The war ended 3 months later, May 1945. Germany surrendered. The shooting stopped. Soldiers started going home. McKnight returned to Manitoba in July, back to the farm, back to the quiet life he'd left behind 5 years earlier. His family asked about the war. He told them some stories, not the one about the children. That one felt too big to share, too heavy to put into words. He tried to forget about it, tried to focus on planting seasons and harvest schedules and all the normal things that filled a farmer's life. But sometimes late at night, he'd remember those faces, 18 pairs of eyes looking up at him from that frozen basement, trusting him to make the right choice. He'd wonder what happened to them. if they'd found their families, if they were okay. The years passed, 1946, 1947, 1950. McKnight got married, had 3 kids of his own, built a good life. The war became something he'd done once a long time ago, just another chapter in his story. Then, in the spring of 1960, he got a letter. The return address was from Germany. McKnight's hands shook a little as he opened it. Inside was a photograph. 5 adults standing together smiling, all of them in their 20s or 30s now, all of them healthy and alive. Behind the photograph was a letter written in careful English. Dear Sergeant McKnight, we do not know if you remember us. We were children you saved in February 1945. We have been searching for you for many years. We would like to meet you and thank you properly. We would like you to know what your kindness meant to us. The letter was signed by 5 names, 5 of the 18 children. They had found each other over the years, reconnected, shared their stories, and they had all remembered the Canadian sergeant with the kind eyes who had carried them to safety. McKnight wrote back immediately. 6 months later, those 5 adults flew to Canada. They met at McKnight's farm on a bright October afternoon. It was awkward at first. These people were strangers, but they were also connected by something deeper than friendship. Connected by a moment when one person had chosen to see their humanity instead of their nationality. They told him what had happened after the medical station, how aid workers had helped find their surviving family members, how some had been reunited with parents who thought they were dead, how others had been taken in by relatives, how they had grown up in a Germany trying to rebuild itself from ashes, how they had gone to school and gotten jobs and built normal lives. Lives they wouldn't have had if not for a cold February night and a sergeant who had refused to follow orders. One of them, the girl who had had severe hypothermia, showed McKnight her hands, all 10 fingers intact. The doctors told me I'd lose them all, she said, but you got me warm fast enough. You saved my life in my hands, Raz. The boy who had lost pieces of his fingers and toes was there too. He worked as a teacher now. These, he said, holding up his damaged hand, remind me every day how lucky I am, how close I came, how much I owe you. They stayed for a week. McKnight's crew came to visit. Davies drove up from Toronto. Wilson came from Ottawa. Patterson flew in from Vancouver. Kowalski had died in a car accident in 1953, but his widow came to represent him. They all sat together, soldiers and the children they'd saved, now adults with children of their own. They ate meals together, told stories, laughed about things that hadn't been funny at the time. Before they left, the 5 Germans present presented McKnight with a gift, a wooden plaque with all 18 names carved into it, the names of every child who had been in that basement. Some had died in the years since, disease, accidents, the normal tragedies that claim people in peacetime. But most were still alive, still out there in the world, living because of a choice 5 soldiers had made 15 years earlier. The story made newspapers again, bigger this time. International coverage. The Canadian military, embarrassed that they had never officially recognized what McKnight had done, finally issued a formal commendation in 1963. 18 years late, but better than nothing. McKnight accepted it quietly. He didn't care much about medals or recognition. He had done what felt right, that was enough. But the story had an impact beyond just McKnight and those 18 children. Military historians started documenting similar cases. They found more than 40 instances in the final months of World War II where Allied soldiers had broken protocol to save enemy civilians. Most of those soldiers had faced punishment or threats of punishment. Most had never been recognized. The publicity around McKnight's case changed that. It started conversations about humanity in warfare, about the difference between following orders and doing what's right, about how war can strip away everything until all that's left is the simple question, what kind of person do you want to be? In 1968, representatives from several countries used McKnight's story as a case study while updating the Geneva Conventions. They added new language about protecting civilians in war zones, about the moral obligations soldiers have to help non-combatants in distress, even if those non-combatants are technically enemy nationals. McKnight never knew how much his decision had influenced international law. He died in 1987 at age 70, surrounded by family, friends, and memories of a life where one cold February night had changed the world for 18 children and countless others in family. His funeral was attended by dozens of people, including 8 adults who had once been frozen children in a German basement. Modern militaries still teach McKnight's story. They use it in ethics classes, in leadership training. They ask young officers the hard questions. What do you do when following orders means letting children die? What do you do when doing the right thing might end your career? What matters more? The rules we write down or the values we claim to believe in? There are no easy answers to those questions. McKnight didn't have easy answers either. He just had a moment in time where he heard crying in the snow and made a choice. A choice that saved 18 lives, a choice that cost him nothing in the end except 3 weeks of anxiety and 15 years of waiting for recognition he didn't really need. The wooden plaque with 18 names still hangs in his family's home. His grandchildren ask about it sometimes. Who were these people? Why are their names on our wall? And the family tells them the story about a cold February night, about a basement full of dying children, about a sergeant who decided that some things matter more than following orders. In that frozen moment, those soldiers chose to see children before they saw nationality. They chose humanity over strategy, compassion over protocol. And in doing so, they proved something essential about human nature. That even in history's darkest chapters, even when everything tells us to see enemies and divisions and reasons to let people suffer, we still have the capacity to recognize each other's fundamental worth. We still have the capacity to choose kindness when kindness is the hardest possible choice. That capacity doesn't make war less terrible. It doesn't make the deaths any less tragic, but it reminds us that we're more than our worst moments, more than the conflicts we create, more than the lines we draw between us and them. Those 18 lives were 18 small lights in an ocean of darkness. But small lights still matter. They still push back against the night, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they shine long enough for others to see by.